All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio. I mentioned on a previous upload that I found out about the book The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman, which is written by Lyndon LaRouche as well as some co-writers. And I mentioned that I found out about this book because I was just reading the headlines about the passing of Lyndon LaRouche on February 12th, 2019, and I saw that he had written the book The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman, and I got my hands on a copy of it. Yeah, I was looking at it on Amazon.com, and it turned out it was actually available for free online. I got my copy from, I believe it was the University of Pennsylvania Library, just had something you could download. And I think the LaRouche movement actually was giving this away for free at a time, so that's why they were able to download the book. But let's talk about Milton Friedman. Once again, he was a very kind of influential free market thinker of the 20th century. And one of the big things about this is if you've ever heard any of his presentations, lectures, interviews, I mean, you're going to be hearing the words freedom and free markets all the time. And I think that really resonates with a lot of people, even to this day. When I look at his videos online, overwhelming positive reception from so many people. They're just like, they love his message of freedom. But this book is called The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman, and I'm just getting started on it. As you see, this is titled Part 1. What I can say about this particular book is that it is something that is trying to share a message that Milton Friedman accuse him of being a charlatan. They don't accuse him of being a liar, a fraud, or someone who's saying things that he doesn't genuinely believe. They're criticizing Milton Friedman, but they're saying, yes, he just does genuinely believe this stuff. However, the policies that he advocated for were beneficial to the global elites, to beneficial to the people in power, and he was very useful for them. That was how Milton Friedman got to the status where he was. If I understand, Milton Friedman developed a sort of, kind of distrust of the government because of some things associated with the Great Depression. It was like he blamed the government for the Great Depression, and that's why he really began to lean toward private sector strength, like a strong private sector would be push civilization forward. Whereas Lyndon LaRouche and the people who are associated with this book are all about a strong public sector is what moves civilization forward. If you have a strong private sector, then that's just going to create monopolies, and then the monopolies are going to move the political system to their advantage. But there's some very interesting things that we have in the beginning parts of this book. For example, Milton Friedman is someone who heavily praised Hong Kong and their use of freedom and free trade. I mean, even in his appearances on Phil Donahue, which are some of the most entertaining episodes of Phil Donahue ever, it's like he talks about how Hong Kong was a very good example of free trade. Now, the Lyndon LaRouche movement has countered that by saying free trade is just kind of an example of free slave trade, free drug trade, and they even mentioned that because of the policies of the former British Empire, there was an increased amount of heroin in Hong Kong. They don't cite any like source about where they got this from, but to say that like an enormous amount of Hong Kong was addicted to heroin. Once again, they don't cite any sources, but what they're sort of trying to say is that this kind of undertone that is going through the book is that the reason why we can't have like legalized heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine. I mean, we're not talking about marijuana, we're talking about the hard drugs. The reason why we can't have these things, which apparently Milton Friedman did advocated, for the legalization of all these drugs. Ron Paul did as well, very adamant about that in 1988 when he ran for president on the Libertarian ticket. It's like the reason why we don't have those legal is because society cannot tolerate it. That's their argument. I'm just kind of, saying what's kind of written in the book. Society can't tolerate it because you're going to have companies that are trying to maximize their profits. A corporation exists to maximize profits, right? So if you have companies selling heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine en masse, their objective will be to make as many people addicted to heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine as possible. And we have an opioid crisis in America, and you have like the board of directors of Rite Aid trying to block anti-opioid crisis measures because they want to keep expanding the company outward, and they don't even. It is irrelevant to them whether or not they're affecting, you know, whether or not people are becoming addicted to their products. This is very clear with something like fentanyl. But when, like we would also have things like heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, if companies are able to sell those, then their objective would be to make as many people addicted as possible because it is profitable. So says this book. So that's kind of one attack that they make against Milton Friedman and his statements about drugs. Another thing that they say about him is that he is someone who advocated for Nazi policies, and he was an enormous fan of the Nazi German economist Hjalmar Schacht, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I believe it's Schacht, Hjalmar Schacht, and he is like the reason why the LaRouche movement is saying this about him is they have this enormous hypothesis that the Nazi Germany, and the former British Empire kind of were connected by the same financial controls, and it even carried over into America via a certain individual named Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush, and through his firm, and like he was a financier for Nazi Germany. And they also sort of say that Milton Friedman was right on board with them. And Milton Friedman was also an advisor to the Margaret Thatcher government, as they call it. They don't say an advisor to Margaret Thatcher. The Margaret Thatcher government is the exact phrase that is included. So what they're trying to say is Milton Friedman is kind of bringing Nazi thinking into the British government, but the LaRouche movement says that is nothing new. That is completely an age-old, same old story. That the financial controls between Nazi Germany and the former British Empire were always there in place. I mean, they're politically opposed to each other, but economically connected, as well as carried over into some places like the Americas, because America is a former British colony, right? I mean, at least, the original 13. And that's another thing that the LaRouche movement has expressed in the past, that we got independence from America, but the financial and economic controls and the economic connections never went away. But I mean, if you're like, are you following everything I'm saying? Because this is some far out stuff. This is some complicated stuff, and it's also not proven. We have to bear in mind that these Larouchian arguments are only one interpretation of the historical data. They receive very little mainstream support. Not to mention, I mean, it's just not that many people are coming to the same historical conclusions. It's very well argued, but like a lot of their books don't have citations, but they do have some very impressive things. I mean, like impressive articulations, but you want to talk about being articulate. Milton Friedman was an extraordinarily articulate individual, and they do cite this in this book. They said he was an articulate, well spoken, very thoughtful individual, and that is one of the reasons that propelled him to his higher level of success in life. And they also want to say, I mean, like if you look at something like his response about the Ford Pinto, when like Ford, recognized that there was a defect in their Pintos, if there were crashes, then the gas tanks would explode, and if they put a $13 piece of plastic in between the gas tank and the other parts of the car, then the car would not explode. But they did the math, and it was actually cheaper to just let the accidents happen and let approximately 1,000 people die from this than recalling the Ford Pintos. And Milton Friedman advocated for it, and he said something that was just fascinating when he's like, you're talking about the price, not the principle. You would never ask them to recall the cars if the price of the block of plastic was $1 million or $1 billion. If it's $13, you're only telling them to do that because it's cheap. And you should never have an economic policy where it's like you're going to try and save lives only if it's cheap. And he really makes you start to think in another way. And Milton Friedman was a brilliant individual. I mean, like once again, look at his interviews with Phil Donahue, and you can just see how skilled of a debater he was. But at the same time, there's sort of a reason why that they wrote this book, The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman. Once again, they're saying that Milton Friedman believed everything he said genuinely, but it's just that the policies that he advocated were more beneficial to the governing elites, and they benefited the financial and economic controls that have been in place for hundreds of years. The sort of the LaRouche movement has this kind of proposition that empires do not fall, they simply morph into different forms. And even if you don't want to say all empires, the British Empire never collapsed. It just morphed into a different forms in the 19 well, yes, in the 1900s, the 20th century, they kind of lost their empire and territory, but they rebounded in terms of not only economic and financial control, but also in intelligence, MI5, MI6, as well as just intelligence gathering, also through U.S. organizations and through individuals like Henry Kissinger, and they have their own detailed reasons why. But the big things that they want to target Milton Friedman for are saying just once again that the policies that he advocates for do not necessarily benefit the common individual as well as they try to represent that to be. They're trying to say when you have these type of free market policies, they benefit the governing elite systems, the oligarchs, the people who already have the money and the power will benefit more from Milton Friedman's kind of free market theories as opposed to from, well, having a strong public sector. But this is kind of a divided issue. This is an enormously divided issue. There are two sides to everything. And once again, Milton Friedman does argue his side very clearly. And as you can see, I mean, like, it's not exactly that I'm on the fence. I'm not on the fence about either one of these guys. It's more just like I see kind of the value in both of their platforms, and I try to find the good in each side and what can we learn from these sorts of plans. What can we learn from what these guys are saying? But some okay, so we talked about Hong Kong, we talked about Milton Friedman and legalization of drugs, we talked about having free markets and a strong private sector leading to prosperity. And we're going to do some more uploads on the ugly truth about Milton Friedman, only because I find this a fascinating subject, and I'm glad to have found the copy of this book online. And that's all for me now, and until next time.